Hey guys, welcome to our next lesson, actually our next unit. So this unit is going to be on immigration and industrialization in the United States. And so in this lesson, we're going to be introduced to industrialization. We're going to take a look at the rise of the United States from an agricultural nation to an industrial powerhouse in the years following the Civil War. And in this unit, we're going to really take a look at the rise of folks that are known as the titans of industry or the robber barons, and the rise of labor unions in the United States. So before we get to that, though, we're going to look at the causes, the reasons why the United States goes through industrialization during this period. So let's take a look first at what you guys need to be doing. So as you're watching and listening to this presentation, make sure you have in another window. This activity is open and ready for you to fill out. So make sure that you are completing these guided notes, basically this graphic organizer guided notes activity as you go through this lesson. Also, make sure that you have answered the bell ringers. So there are 3 questions I wanted you to answer. I posted on Google Classroom. So these are just for me to understand maybe what you might already know about this topic, see if you do know anything about it, if you remember anything from any other classes you've taken. So I asked you 3 questions. I want to know what you think the Industrial Revolution was, what country you think it began in, and what was needed, do you think, in a country for industrialization to take place. And we're going to be answering some of these questions in the next few slides in the rest of this presentation. So make sure you pause this video, go over there and answer those questions for me. Then we can continue. So our objective for today, you're going to be able to describe the causes, the reasons for the growth of industrialization in America. And you're going to be doing this by completing a summary template. I will have already gone over the template with you at the beginning of class, and I will also be going over it at the end of this lesson as well, before I send you off to do that. So make sure that you ask questions if you are unsure about what you need to do by the end. So we're going to review a little bit. This is going to provide an overview of what it is, exactly what the Industrial Revolution is. So what is it? First of all, it's the process of developing machine production of goods. And so before, as we all know, the United States really primarily began as an agricultural nation, but started shifting in the late 1800s, early 1900s to industry, manufacturing goods. However, after the Civil War, the United States was still largely agricultural. And this meant that most people in the United States were farmers. They grew their own food, sold crops. But by the 1920s, the United States was pretty much transformed into the world's leading industrial power. And we're going to see what kind of impact that has on our history as we talk about World War I and World War II. So before we do that, obviously, we're going to continue to learn more about what the Industrial Revolution was. So where did it begin? It originally began in England, and it spread from England into Europe and into the United States initially. And this meant that when it began in America in the late 1800s. It began after England had already gone through industrialization. So we were a little bit late. It came to us a little bit late. Why is it important? It began our transformation from, like I said, an agricultural nation into an industrialized nation. And it also leads to America becoming a world power. Because with more money, generating more wealth, making more goods, the United States is able to engage in trade around the world with other countries and to influence geopolitics in a way that they wouldn't otherwise be able to. And how did industrialization happen in the United States? And here I'm pointing out 3 factors, and we're going to go in depth in each of these in the coming slides. But here's an overview of what they are. So the first is labor. And this means that America had a large workforce. We had many people, right? And a lot of them they were immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe during this period after the Civil War. Millions of people came from this region of the world, from Eastern and Southern Europe, including places like Italy, for example. And many of them were former farm workers. And so In addition to that, we also had an abundance of natural resources, things like iron, for example, coal, and oil, and also spread of technology from England, inventions like the cotton gin, for example, and other machines that allowed our large workforce to use our natural resources and produce goods, manufactured goods. So when you combine all three together in factories, you have the technology, the machines, the resources, the natural resources, and the labor, the people to do the work, a lot of them. That's how industrialization occurred. So, before we go into those in depth, we're going to watch a quick video. I actually have it open here in the next tab.
1,000 locomotives were in daily use around the country. And yes, across the Atlantic, around the same time of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, the American colonies won independence from British rule, but not from British technology. Because the American colonies had an abundance of land and not enough workers, there was little incentive to invest in expensive machines when hand power would do. But by the turn of the 19th century, America was itself in need of a better transportation system and even more independence economically from Britain. Men like Samuel Slater, known in the UK as Slater the Trader and in the US as father of the American Industrial Revolution, brought the British factory system of work to men, women, and children of the day. Eli Whitney's cotton gin created a massive growth in the production of cotton and slavery in the South. Soon increased production with expanded systems of credit and transportation of raw materials helped push America into industrialization. Like in Britain, infrastructure was improved. Canals, like that of New York's 364-mile Erie Canal, along with the introduction of steam technology to water transportation, helped fuel more economic growth. This growth was also fueled by the average American's willingness towards innovation and entrepreneurial spirit. Government supported the use of railways as early as 1829, and by 1850, 14,000 kilometers of railroad lines had been built, and formed the world's first transcontinental railway system by 1869. So there we have it. By the 1840s, the advances in technology and worker organization had become adopted by many countries that saw the power and profit in industrialization. But as new economic systems and social theories took center stage, each country had its own difficult questions to ask, national identities to shape, and a whole lot more battles to fight that would come to form from this new industrial era. So join us in our next episode as we...
Right. So, as you can see, this kind of gave a quick rundown of some of the reasons why the United States was able to go through industrialization, how and why the Industrial Revolution came to the United States. And really, the important thing to take away from that was the advent of technology, certain machines, machinery, and the tremendous amount of natural resources that we had available, as well as conscious efforts made by the United States government, which led to industrialization. One important thing that perhaps the reason why the United States did not necessarily go through industrialization early on compared to England, war. For example, the United States had gone to war, and there also earlier on wasn't very many people in the United States living in the United States. It wasn't a very populated country at first. So that could be why also we didn't enter industrialization until a little bit later. But so we're going to take a closer look at how this happened. So reason number one is labor, right? So the U.S. had, like I said, a huge labor force, many recent immigrants from Southeast Europe, and many of them were former farm workers. So the United States had a large and growing urban population, and this helped to provide labor. And it also helped to provide a market to both make and sell the goods produced by the Industrial Revolution. So by having more people, we had more workers who could help us to industrialize, but we also had more people to sell things to. So this was a very important reason why industrialization takes place. Many of the people who, like I said, made up this large labor force included recent immigrants from Southeast Europe, the Balkans. Actually, approximately 20 million immigrants from South and Southeastern Europe came to the United States between the years 1880 and 1920. Also, The next reason, natural resources. So America had plenty of natural resources, like I mentioned, to start industrialization, and that included oil, coal and iron. And these natural resources helped to fuel industrial growth. And the United States government itself was also very supportive of this rise in industry and in businesses that were focused on industry. So here you can take a look at this chart here and see the dramatic rise in all these countries, in the United States, Germany, Great Britain, and France, in the production of things like iron, steel, and coal. And you see in this chart how the United States, which is the yellow line in this chart, in these graphs, you can see how the yellow line dramatically surpasses all of the other countries during this period of time. So let's take a look at the three biggest items here. We have oil, coal, and steel. Oh my. So, oil. There was an oil boom, and it spread across the United States, beginning in western Pennsylvania, making it all the way to Texas during this time period. And during this time period, the petroleum that came from the oil was used to make kerosene, a very popular fuel back then for things like lights and other products. Also, gasoline was initially a byproduct and originally was thrown away. And it wouldn't be until the invention of the combustible engine that used gasoline in the late 1800s where folks would actually start to realize that gasoline was a useful product. And the United States also had a large natural deposits of coal and iron in places like Minnesota and out west. And as the United States expanded west, they discovered these rich and large deposits of coal and iron, and the United States industry made good use of it. And coal production actually provided fuel for factories and homes, which is very important. In the United States in 1870, about 33 million tons of coal were produced, and only 30 years later, about 250 plus million tons were produced, which is a dramatic rise in production with steel. And steel was made out of iron, right? But it's iron that is stronger through something known as the Bessemer process. And that removes things that can make the iron rust and weak. And steel is much stronger, much more flexible. And so when steel can be produced in large quantities in the United States, it was used to make things like railroad tracks, to make barbed wire, steel plows, mechanical reapers, bridges, skyscrapers, which helped cities to get bigger. And this helped to lead to growth of cities like, for example, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So if you're ever wondering why they're called the Pittsburgh Steelers, it's because steel was produced in a lot of factories in Pittsburgh. So here is a um, picture of an oil field in Los Angeles with all sorts of oil derricks that would pump oil from the ground, right? So um, even in our own backyard, we had industrialization take place, as you can see in this photo. And you also, as you can see here, here's a photo of a steel factory just outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They're not necessarily the prettiest things to look at. As you can see, look at all the smokestacks in the areas where they would have been producing steel, converting iron into steel during this time period. You also saw, let me skip forward, and new inventions coming about during this time period. Um, so first, you had also all sorts of things, these inventions that affected daily life and industry. One of them would be electricity, and although it wasn't actually an invention, electricity has always existed. Harnessing that electricity, being able to control it and use it, and allowed for it to provide power safely and cheaply, right? So it wasn't that it was a new, like we invented electricity, but we learned how to harness it. And it was used for things like light bulbs, streetcars, cooling fans, printing presses. Factories also could now move away from the rivers, right? They didn't have to rely on water power, and they could move wherever they pleased as a result. Also, simple things like typewriters and telephones changed the way we communicated and created new job opportunities for women. For example, in 1870, women made up less than 5% of office workers, but by 1910, only 40 years later, women made up nearly 40% of clerical workers, so office workers, oftentimes secretaries, thanks to using typewriters and telephones. And women also continue to make garments along with men, but they would make a lot of them at home before the Industrial Revolution. But with the onset of the Industrial Revolution and the relocation of factories, many women began to work in factories producing these garments alongside men. And one of the inventions that helped to increase production of clothing, textiles, was Eli Whitney's cotton gin. And it basically is that machine right there at the top, and it allowed us to more quickly and more efficiently produce garments. And there's a light bulb, and finally the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. So remember, Thomas Edison, he invented the light bulb, allowed people to work longer hours. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, more efficient clothing, textile production. And Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, which increased communication. Here is a sign you might have seen in an office building or an apartment building after electric bulbs were installed, because people weren't really sure how to use light switches, right? So it was advising them to not try to light it with a match. They were still getting used to using electricity. And here is let me skip through here, a photo of some telephone operators. So notice all those plugs in that they are using. They would have to move them around to connect calls. So it used to be that uh, these women would have to do that in order to connect your call to the other person. And the next invention, perhaps unlike any other, was Henry Ford's assembly line, right? And perhaps there's no other invention that affects everyday American life in the 20th century and even today more than the car, the automobile. So even though the automobile existed in the 1800s, it took Henry Ford to make it accessible to the public. And he did this through his use of the idea of the assembly line. And the assembly line was used to manufacture cars. And the assembly line was a system, it helped to increase worker output and productivity. It enabled workers to make things more quickly and easily. And the idea was to allow workers to basically remain in one place at one station and master one repetitive action, so that they'd only produce or attach maybe one piece of the car. And then the car would move down the assembly line to the next person who would do a different part. They had a different, unique job. And then after they were done with that, it would go to the next person and the next person, and it would continue like that down the assembly line. And by using this idea of the assembly line, the time it took to build a car, Henry Ford's Model T, his car, it went down from 12 hours total to make one car, down to 2 hours and 30 minutes total. So it's a very important idea and invention, right? Now, of course, the invention that had arguably even a greater impact on the United States is the railroad, which was nicknamed the Iron Horse because they replaced horses and carriages as the main form of transportation in the 1800s. So in 1861, right at the start of the Civil War, the United States had about 30,000 miles of railroad track, and just about 30 years later, the United States would have 180,000 plus miles of railroad track, which is just a rapid expansion, right? And in 1869, the first Trans-Pacific Railroad was created when, or Transcontinental Railroad was recreated, when the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroads met finally in Utah. So now you could travel completely by railroad back then. You could travel by railroad from the East Coast to the West Coast. And this was the first transcontinental railroad between the Eastern and Western United States. And it was mostly most of it was built by Chinese and Irish labor. Immigrants who came to the United States and sought work were able to find it on the railroads. And of course, the expansion of these railroads led to the expansion of other industries because a railroad needs iron, it needs coal, it needs steel. It also needed lumber, glass, and many other materials and resources in order to be made, in order to make the railroads and the locomotives. And as the railroad went west, this led to the creation of new towns and led to the growth of cities and also created new markets for goods. People and goods were now able to move all over the country and they weren't limited to just one region. So here's a map of the railroads in 1890, so about 25 years after the end of the Civil War. And notice how much it's changed so drastically. Look at the railroads in red, which were in operation in 1870. And then you can take a look at the green lines. Those represent the new railroads in operation by 1890. As you can see, there's way more railroads, and in such a short period of time, you can see how rapid that expansion was, right? And here is a picture, here's a photo when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed out in Utah and sealed with something called the Golden Spike. So if you ever make it out into Utah one day, you can actually see it for yourself. It's definitely something interesting to go see if you ever go on a road trip, maybe during summer or something. Definitely something interesting to see. Now, again, to emphasize the importance of factories. So, factories, they brought in labor, machines together, right? Let's go back. And these were very important places. These were places that brought together labor, the large labor force, and the number of people in the United States, the workers. And it brought together those people with the new machines, the new technology. And by bringing them together, the factories became places where we were able to produce goods at an incredibly fast rate. However, there were, of course, downsides to all of this industrialization. First of all, there were environmental issues. This led to an increase in air, groundwater pollution from factories. You also had growth of cities, like I mentioned earlier, and this meant that people were living closer together. And in some cases, back then, there were growths of urban slums. People they weren't living in the best conditions in cities back then. There were also political downsides because there wasn't much government regulation of business. Businesses were often left to do, their own things, and the government would support these businesses by giving away land to the railroads, for example. And then the railroads would take that land that they'd received for free and they'd go and sell it to other businesses. So basically, they were making money off of something they had gotten for free from the government. And they would also bribe government officials for political favors, which was obviously against the law. And there were also some economic downsides. You had competing railroads that would often fix prices and overcharge their clients, particularly farmers, because farmers relied so heavily on the railroads to ship their goods and crops. And the railroads knew they relied on them and they took advantage of it. And this lack of regulation of railroad expansion actually ends up leading to a major economic collapse in 1893. And as you can see on this slide, there are also many personal downsides. In a lot of these factories, you had children working jobs, for example. Just in 1870 alone, there's a statistic, there was 750,000 children under the age of 15 who were working jobs, and many of them were working in factories. And these factories, you also had very dangerous working conditions. You had very low wages for the workers in them. And also, as these businesses headed out west, particularly railroads, this intensified conflicts with Native Americans, as I mentioned in one of our previous lessons. As it brought more people out west, it intensified more conflicts, and sometimes railroads were built on land that was supposed to belong to the Native Americans. So there were some downsides to this industrialization, in addition to all the good, positive things that we were mentioning earlier. So now that we have gone through and learned about some of the reasons for the growth of industrialization, let's think, what were the reasons do you think that were most important? What were the most important reasons leading to the growth of industrialization in America? Try to think about that. I'm going to have you respond to that as a question on Google Classroom. So make sure that you're ready to answer that question. Use your notes to help you answer this question. Make sure that you are explaining your reasoning. Tell me why you think it's the most important cause. Tell me what it is. And you're going to be doing this wrap up activity. You're going to create pictures. You can create pictures or write a summary in the space provided. And basically, what you're going to do is you're going to summarize the major events during the Industrial Revolution in America. So I want you to find a picture that represents, summarizes each of these reasons. And you're going to be using, putting those images that symbolize each of these reasons on this worksheet. Or you may summarize the four major, the five major events and reasons in writing if you don't want to do a picture. But if you do a picture, you need to make sure that you are drawing it. I want you to actually try to draw some of it using Cami. I don't mind if you maybe take a few images from Google and use those to help you create your picture, whatever it is. But I do want some sort of drawing that you've created yourself using Cami. So make sure that you do that and tell me what each of these mean and what they represent and how they're related to industrialization, as we've learned. So as you do that, let me know if you need any help, if you have any questions. I'll be there in the Google Meet with you. So thank you so much and good luck on the assignment.